The main frontal assault was a disaster, with the well-protected and armed German defenders picking off most of the troops on the landing craft or narrow beach with their heavy machine guns and 81mm mortars, and the tanks unable to climb the steep shingle beach into the promenade. Those tanks that did manage to surmount the beach found themselves trapped by debris in the streets. 90% of the Royal Canadian Engineers responsible for dismantling anti-tank obstructions lay dead or wounded, making any tank progress impossible. Rather than pull back, the troops continued to be landed, even if many had to be forced off the landing craft at pistol point. Of the 6,000 soldiers and commandos who took part, over 900 were killed, 586 were wounded, and almost 2,000 captured. The Royal Regiment of Canada suffered 97% casualties in under 4 hours. Bodies kept being washed up on the beach for a week afterwards. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be doing Chapter 13 of the Mountbattens. If you are hoping to get some more Harry and Meghan this week, don't worry, I'm going to do another video this weekend, but I had not done another chapter on this book, and there's lots of people who are actually enjoying that one, so I'm going to give them a little bit more of this book. This chapter was crazy, and honestly, I wasn't really sure how much I would enjoy the chapter because it's about the Dieppe raid, and though I didn't know much about it, I might have majored in history, but I don't super love talking about battles and war, mostly because I can't always quite figure out what's happening. And so I was like, we'll see how this one goes. And I found it captivating, so I hope you will too. This really exposes some more of how Dickie can spin a disaster into his favor. Now, I will say, to be fair, he doesn't bear the full responsibility for how disastrous this raid turned out to be, but he certainly does bear some of the brunt, and his desperation to retell the narrative later on in life and really excuse himself for the parts that he played that showed negligence and foolishness. He will never take responsibility for a thing that he should not have done. I don't think that so far we have ever heard him admit that he might have made an error. Never. I haven't heard it. Part of the reason is that he is so afraid that if he says, oh, had I to do it again, I would have done it differently, then it's going to dim his star and he'll never be able to get ahead. I think a lot of people do that. I think a lot of people think that if they ever take any responsibility for something that they did, then that means that they'll never be able to get ahead again. You see parents do this a lot with their kids. They won't apologize to their kids if they know they did something wrong. Maybe they were too harsh, impatient, or whatever. And they think, I will lose my respect with this child if I ever admit that I did something wrong. When in reality, if you would actually just be a human being for a second and say, hey, you know what, I really screwed up. I apologize. In the same case with Mountbatten, if he'd ever said, I look back at it now with the wisdom I have, I wouldn't have done that. The things that I did, I think people would have respected him even more, and there might not have been such a undercurrent of distaste for him. Because people really, he had the people who loved him, and he had the people who hardcore disliked him. And so I think that part of the reason they disliked him was his inability to accept where he had been wrong. This is a longer chapter than we're typically used to reading, so I'm going to go ahead and just get into it. It starts out by saying that the Dieppe raid was meant to address American and Russian demands for the opening of another front, and as a modest substitute for Operation Sledgehammer. Its point was as much political as military, though sometimes sold as an exercise in the challenge of capturing a working port without destroying it in the process. Dieppe had the advantage of being reached from Britain under cover of summer darkness, and was a prized target given the number of ships sheltering there and a nearby radar station and airfield. Now those are the ostensible reasons why they went after this particular port. That all sounds very well and good. Later on they'll spin it as, well, we were doing some planning, some practice raids for D-Day. And there is a case that could be made for that as well. Lessons learned here were applied there, for sure. But when we read later in the chapter why they were really doing it, or why people suspect they were really doing it, that makes a lot more sense. Anyway, we'll keep on. You'll find out later what the real point was. Preparations began in the spring of 1942, but it was given fresh impetus by pressure from the Russians. The first plan was for the flankings of about 5,000 men, several miles either side of the port. But this was quickly abandoned as taking too long for an operation designed to put troops ashore for less than 15 hours, and it would lose the element of surprise. Mountbatten accepted a revised plan of a frontal assault as long as there was a heavy air bombardment, But again, concerns were expressed about losing the advantage of surprise. Thus begins a series of red flags. In the planning of this raid, there were numerous times when people said, I don't think that's really going to work. And Mountbatten's like, fiddly dee, we'll figure that out while we're doing it. The bombardment was agreed by Churchill on June 1st. But then reversed 4 days later with the Commander-in-Chief of Southeastern Command, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, while Mountbatten was in Washington. The force commander, Major General Hamilton Ham Roberts, argued that bombing would create blockages and make it difficult for the tanks to traverse the narrow streets. Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the Air Force commander, felt Dieppe was so small that bombs would either fall into the sea or inland, and the Air Force might be better employed on diversionary tactics. The only covering fire, therefore, would have to come from the sea. Mountbatten wanted a battleship, but the recent loss of the Prince of Wales and repulse to air attack put paid to naval support. Ditto, it was regarded as too risky to send any cruisers. All that was on offer were some destroyers with guns of modest caliber. Again, another red flag. If you can't bomb the place with air support and you don't have the proper ships to attack from the sea, and all you have are some cruisers with modest caliber guns, it might stand to reason that there would be a better time to do this when a better plan could be formulated. But no. With all of these things, you're thinking, okay, well, this sounds like y'all shouldn't do it. And with just those things alone, it sounds like y'all shouldn't do it. But it gets far worse because Mountbatten learned that a political decision had been taken to substitute highly trained Marines and commandos with inexperienced Canadian troops. The plan was beginning to unravel, but the operation was taking on a momentum of its own, not least under the pressure to appease Ivan Maysky, the Russian ambassador in London, and his masters. Mountbatten, naturally impatient and overconfident, took the decision to proceed with the operation anyway, picking the first suitable day after June 24th. So they do a dress rehearsal, and it's just as much of a nightmare as you would suspect, given the fact that they don't have the fire support they need, and now they're trying to do it with a bunch of underperforming Canadian troops who I'm not sure why they chose to do this. I don't understand the political reason. I think maybe it had something to do with the fact that these Canadian troops had been hanging out in England for 2 years and hadn't seen any combat. And so they wanted to use these guys. But on something that was this important, they should have just used their Marines and their commandos to do a job that definitely needed doing precisely. It wasn't just like a free-for-all. Well, a dress rehearsal 2 weeks before did not augur well, with the darkness being blamed for troops being landed in the wrong place the wrong time. The tanks arrived an hour after the infantry, and many of the troops suffered severe seasickness. In the end, on July 7th, bad weather led to the cancellation of a raid. Recent raids on Alderney and Bayonne had also been halted, and prudence would have been to leave alone what had become known as Operation Rudder, not least because the likelihood was that the Germans had now been alerted that Dieppe was a target. So, this operation, bear in mind, it had been called Operation Rudder. That's what this whole thing had initially been known as. And after such a poor dress rehearsal, you would have thought that already the red flags were waving. Already we have troops coming that are inexperienced at this sort of thing. The dress rehearsal is a nightmare. You would have thought that any thinking person would have said, we are not prepared, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the firepower. Let's just hold off. Let's not just throw people into a meat grinder. But ego prevails. Tom Bailey Groham, the Naval Force commander, and Ham Roberts sent Mountbatten a memo arguing that the operation should be abandoned for good. Montgomery wrote to his immediate superior recommending that no similar operation be contemplated in future, but shortly afterwards, he was posted to the 8th Army in North Africa. Dieppe was the only plan in the locker, and for the sake of morale and sustaining his own reputation for delivering high-profile attacks, Mountbatten felt something should be done. The red flags continued to wave. Ignoring the warnings, he suggested the operation be resurrected under the name Operation Jubilee. Changing the name of the operation, none of the plans have been changed. Same plans in the books. We're just going to cross out Operation Rudder and write Operation Jubilee. And go on our merry way. That's the big plan. See, his ego was constantly getting in the way of his judgment. Intensive lobbying took place over the coming days until Bailey Grohman was pushed out and the various doubting Thomases, such as Leigh-Mallory and Roberts, brought back on board. Admiral Bertram Ramsay's entreaties to Mountbatten to abort the raid on July 25th were ignored. According to the new naval commander, John Hughes Hallett, Mountbatten restated the case for returning Operation Rudder on July 11th. Nothing was put in writing, but General Ismay informed the chiefs of staff and the Prime Minister, who gave their verbal authority. Certainly King George VI knew the next day, writing in his diary, "Dickie gave me the latest news of the COS conversations. He is rearranging Rudder under another name for the end of August." According to F.H. Hinsley, official historian of British intelligence in the Second World War, the chiefs of staff gave their approval to Jubilee on August 12th. Churchill also appears to have known, telling Russian President Joseph Stalin on August 15th that there, quote, "will be a serious raid in August, although the weather might upset it. It will be a reconnaissance in force. Some 8,000 men with 50 tanks will be landed. The object is to get information and to create the impression of an invasion." On the same day, he asked General Pug Ismay, his chief military advisor, what his position about renewal of Rudder. To which Ismay replied the following day, "Jubilee, which is renewed Rudder, in all essential features, is due to be carried out at first light August 18th, and then Jubilee has started. It is therefore not true, as is often claimed, that Mountbatten acted alone without the knowledge of his superiors." So that has sort of been like the historical scuttlebutt, that Mountbatten just, against all odds and against all authority, went ahead and just mounted this enormous raid that was a complete catastrophe, and it was all his fault. That's not true. But what is true is that many people who should have known about it didn't know about it. So Churchill knew about it. He bothered his pretty little head to let the king know about it, because these are all the people who are going to help him continue to climb the ladder. But many of his intelligence officers and people who should have known what was happening had no clue that this raid was going to go down. And there's some reasons given later in the chapter for why that is, but for much of history, it has just been assumed that Mountbatten rushed in so that he could be big man on campus. And look what I just did. Look what I managed to pull off. That's kind of like my MO. I just do these amazing raids. It wasn't an amazing raid, it was a catastrophe. But of course, he ends up spinning that later too. Well, big questions loom. Why was Mountbatten so keen to press ahead, given all the reservations? Could it have been personal glory and the chance to lead the naval aspect of the D-Day invasion? Peter Murphy told General Dallas Brooks in an interview on August 6, 1942, "The operation is considered very critical from the point of view of the CCO's personal career. If he brings this off, he is the top of the world, and he will be given complete control." But like I said a second ago, well, good for him. He's found a way to climb that corporate ladder, but at the expense of everybody else who should have known something about this. Mountbatten always claimed that Churchill and General Sir Alan Brooke had supported Jubilee, but that for the sake of security, few others should be told, and that included the Defense Committee, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the Intelligence Services, and the Inter-Service Security Board. Nothing was committed to paper, and amidst the thousands of pieces of paper on the operation, there is not a single one signing it off. It also meant no more rehearsals. What? See, at first glance, all of this looks like some serious breach of protocol that somebody with just an enormous ego has barreled through and just done his own thing for his own name. And there might be some part of that that is true. Certainly that was characteristic of him. And I do think that there's certainly a part of him that enjoyed yet one more excuse to just sort of call the shots on his own without having to get a whole lot of people in on it. But again, there is a potential reason why he did not tell anybody about this. But how exactly did this raid go? Well, in the early hours of Wednesday, August 19th, 1942, now slightly near daybreak to avoid naval collisions, an armada of 237 ships, ranging from destroyers and transporters to MTBs and minesweepers, sailed for Dieppe. It included the first Americans to fight on mainland Europe and, interestingly enough, the future creator of James Bond, Commander Ian Fleming, from the Naval Intelligence Department's Operational Intelligence Center. That's very interesting that he should have been roped in on this whole thing. This Naval Intelligence Department's Operational Intelligence Center managed to send somebody in, and yet none of the other individuals who should have known knew. Defense Committee didn't know, First Lord of the Admiralty didn't know, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Intelligence Service, and the Inter-Service Security Board didn't know, but the Naval Intelligence Department's Operational Intelligence Center had a man on board. Interesting. The delay into August meant the raid had to take place over one tide and not two, reducing the operation to a mere 6 hours. There's no time. The first signs of trouble came at 3:47 a.m., when German Army trawlers intercepted 3 commandos' boats, which included the naturalist Peter Scott, thereby alerting the Dieppe garrison and delaying the commandos' carefully synchronized landing. Oh, crisis. In spite of that, commandos led by Lord Lovett captured and destroyed a battery 6 miles to the west of town, and to the east a similar attack gained its objective. Well, so that's some good news, but the main frontal assault was a disaster, with the well-protected and armed German defenders picking off most of the troops on the landing craft or narrow beach with their heavy machine guns and 81mm mortars, and the tanks unable to climb the steep shingle beach into the promenade. Those tanks that did manage to surmount the beach found themselves trapped by debris in the streets. 90% of the Royal Canadian Engineers responsible for dismantling anti-tank obstructions lay dead or wounded, making any tank progress impossible. Rather than pull back, the troops continued to be landed, even if many had to be forced off the landing craft at pistol point. Of the 6,000 soldiers and commandos who took part, over 900 were killed, 586 were wounded, and almost 2,000 captured. The Royal Regiment of Canada suffered 97% casualties in under 4 hours. Bodies kept being washed up on the beach for a week afterwards. An informal inquiry held 2 days later revealed a shocking picture of panic, confusion, and incompetence, including evidence that the beachmaster had refused to leave one of the 2 heavy-duty landing craft. So the reality was devastating, and the panic was intense. And of course, under those conditions, with people just literally getting on the beach only to be slaughtered, captured, or injured, and no hope of making any progress, you can imagine that the fear that would already have been in that situation was tenfold when you realize that there's no point of me going on. Like, you're watching people being murdered as you're coming up to the beach, and there's like, that's it for you. There's not even any hope of the objective being reached because the tanks can't get through and all the bodies are in the way. Wild. And you've got commanders who aren't doing their job. But then, of course, the sanitized report comes out, and they described it in this way. They said that a capital ship could have operated during the first hours of daylight without undue risk and could probably have turned the tide of a battle ashore in our favor. Well, but probable is not what happened. I mean, what happened was panic, confusion, and incompetence. So to tell me what could have happened, well, yeah, I know what the plan was, but is that what happened? The report's recommendations included a higher proportion of military forces to be held in reserve, tanks not to be landed until a beach had established, and the need for greater naval covering fire. Now, what we just read is devastating. That sounds like the worst disaster that we've read yet in this book, and maybe one of the worst disasters that happened of any raid that Mountbatten planned. But there were things that they learned that did help them later, both in the landings in North Africa and then even D-Day itself, which Mountbatten is going to lean very heavily on later in life to be like, yeah, but if it hadn't been for me, we wouldn't have known what to do in D-Day, so... Now, clearly capturing a port without it being destroyed was going to be nearly impossible. So that objective that they said, well, we're doing this raid because we want to see if we can capture a place without destroying the port, and then we could use it for ourselves. That was one of the things they said the raid was for. But that's obviously not possible. The only option was to bring the port with you, stimulating the development of the portable mulberry harbors that were used at D-Day. In order to seize a port, it must be done from inland, which is exactly what happened on D-Day. Well, they also learned what was needed in the event of a raid like this. Much heavier and more accurate covering fire than that provided by destroyers was essential. And also, a much more highly trained specialist naval assault force with armored landing craft would be required. At Dieppe, the Navy had been averse to sending in ships too close to enemy-held shorelines, but it was realized that as long as there was air superiority, the naval losses were likely to be minimal. The radio navigation system used by the RAF, known as G, was subsequently adopted by the Navy, ensuring on D-Day the safe and timely arrival in the assault area through the strong tidal streams of the channel of the Armada of 4,000 vessels. More communications headquarters ships were made available for the Normandy landings as a result of the experiences at Dieppe, and there was greatly integration of air support through a combined naval and landing force joint command. Lessons learned. But a lot of this, I kind of think they kind of already knew. They already knew going into this raid they needed air support. That was one of the big things at the beginning. How are we going to provide fire support to cover our troops landing if we can't have air support because the Dieppe port's so small that we're just going to either throw our bombs in the water or destroy what we're trying to capture? So then they said, okay, well then we need vessels in the water. But like they already understood the necessity of a combined air and navy support system to the troops going and landing on the beach. That's not exactly new information. So for Mountbatten to later on be like, well, thanks to me, we now know what we needed. We knew that before. That was the whole problem. That's why we thought this raid wouldn't work. That's why it didn't work. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we're like, well, we tested it. Now we know. The Dieppe raid meant that the Germans had to commit greater resources to the west, which was part of the objective. In January 1942, there had been 33 German divisions in the west, which had increased to 35 by September and 52 by November. Unfortunately, this did not alleviate pressure on the Eastern Front, where the number of divisions rose from 163 in January to 182 by September. It did, however, lead them to concentrate on coastal defenses, in the belief that attacking forces could be destroyed on the beach, something which, as a result of Dieppe, was not tried again on D-Day. Though often criticized, Mountbatten was justified in later years to say that lives on D-Day had been saved as a result of the knowledge gained at Dieppe, but it was still a very costly experience. I mean, yeah, you're right. Some of the things that we learned were right, but I mean, that's like if I sat here and sawed my hand off and then said, well, I learned that I need two hands to get through life a little more easily. Yeah, we already knew that. You know, I mean, for him to say, yeah, but lesson learned. We did it, and now we know what we needed to do differently. You knew that before you started out. Okay, but then who is to blame? Because there's massive loss of life, and somebody's going to have to pay the piper. Recriminations still continue over 70 years later. A case can partly be made for Montgomery. The decision to replace commandos with Canadian troops and to cancel the preliminary air bombardment was taken at the June 5, 1942 meeting chaired by him when Mountbatten was not present. The force commander, Ham Roberts, should have recognized that without covering support from the Navy and Air Force, his troops were too exposed. But Canadian troops had been in Britain for 2 years without seeing action, and the troops, their political masters and public opinion at home, were hankering to be allowed to fight. The refusals of both Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, and Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, to provide adequate gunfire and bombardment support was also disastrous. However, how does Mountbatten come into this? Because he does deserve some of the blame. Mountbatten, or at least some of his appointments, were also at fault. German defenses were stronger than intelligence estimates from Combined Operations Headquarters had originally suggested. The man blamed was the head of intelligence at Combined Operations, Dickie's old chum, Casamari, the race car driver who I said, what is he doing in that position? What does he know? And he eventually resigned in February 1943. The depth of the shingle on the beach had not been analyzed. Question mark, question mark, question mark. How in the world are you going to drive a tank up an incline that you haven't even analyzed? How would you plan for tanks to go up the beach to enter the promenade, but you don't even know the angle at which the tanks have to take in order to reach their objective? How could you do that? Then, too, there was the fact that the landing craft crews, vital to punctuality and accurate navigation, were of uneven quality, especially for nighttime inshore navigation, and there was just an overall failure of training. Part of the problem was also down to organization rather than individuals. My own feeling about the Dieppe raid, Montgomery wrote in his memoirs, was that there were far too many authorities with a hand in it. There was not one single operational commander who was solely responsible for the operation from start to finish, a task force commander, in fact. Having 3 force commanders, each with their own planning team, plus Mountbatten and his staff, certainly meant there was no obvious channel of command or responsibility. There was also no contingency planning should things not go as intended, or for a breakdown in communications. In short, the problem with Dieppe was its objectives were never fully clear, and its execution, after constant adjustments, faulty. Isn't that like, I mean, I don't know anything about anything, obviously. But isn't that like rule number 1? If you don't you don't have a plan if you don't have 2 plans. If there's not A and B, then there's no plan at all. I thought that was like just understood. How do you not have a contingency plan? Because the likelihood of this going the way you think it's going to go is pretty minimal. When you see people being slaughtered on the beach with no way to advance, I would say that you need to have a plan for backing up and leaving. But that seems wild that you wouldn't even have plan B. Mountbatten just can't escape responsibility as much as he wants to say, well, thanks to me, I saved lives on D-Day. Well, you didn't save lives at the Dieppe raid, so... Mountbatten, for all his later attempts to distance himself from decisions or deflect responsibility, was the head of combined operations, and the buck stopped with him. If he had had reservations about the raid, he should have canceled it. There were plenty of opportunities to do so, not least when air support and naval firepower were not made available. And Canadian troops replaced commandos and Royal Marines. Yeah, at both of those points, he should have been like, it's over, we're done. We cannot move forward. There's no hope of this going well. I can't even pretend that it will. We have inexperienced people and no fire support. Even I, in my vast ignorance, could see that wouldn't work. He chose not to cancel the raid, overriding those who did raise objections. It appears the raid had taken on a momentum of its own, which few in real authority seemed prepared to question. So why push so hard, though? What was the real reason? There had to be a reason beyond the fact that we want to see if we can take a port and not destroy it. Let's just see if that works. Well, there is another explanation. David O'Keefe has argued that one purpose of the raid was to try and capture a 4-rotor Enigma cipher machine used by the German Navy to encrypt its messages. The British had captured a 3-rotor machine, but with the introduction of the 4-rotor machine in February 1942, they could no longer read German signals. The extra rotor multiplied already difficult odds against decryption another 26 times. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park could no longer warn of submarine attacks, and mounting merchant ship losses in the Atlantic were threatening Britain's supply routes. This came to a head on July 4th, when the PQ-17 convoy was attacked, with only 11 of the 34 ships reaching Iceland. So you can see it's incumbent upon somebody to get their hands on this 4-rotor Enigma machine, because without it, there was just no ability whatsoever to predict the movements of the Germans. Interestingly, right after that attack on PQ-17, a week later, Mountbatten suddenly decided to resurrect Operation Rudder, renamed Operation Jubilee. Remember, he had initially agreed, okay, fine, we'll be done with it. But then later, just shortly after that, he decides, oh, actually, never mind. Let's do it anyway. And of course, people immediately thought, oh, it's because there's no other raid on the books for him. There's nothing else planned. He can't let his reputation start to decline. He has to be known as somebody who's always doing something. That's why he decided to do the raid. But this makes way more sense because I think even as foolhardy as Dickie often was in the face of immediate danger, planning to walk into danger doesn't totally fit who we know him to be. He is a planner and he is a good organizer. So for him to go into something that seems so faulty and so poorly planned doesn't totally match who we know him to be. We know him to be somebody who can't make a good decision in the moment of disaster, but to plan to fail doesn't seem like that totally works with who he is either. Dieppe was a key link in the German Navy's signal chain, and not only had the latest cipher equipment at its shore facilities, but the visiting vessels also held useful cipher material. A frontal raid makes sense if the purpose of the raid was really to seize the code books as quickly as possible from naval headquarters in the Hotel Modern. And this would also explain the involvement of Fleming's intelligence assault unit and secrecy of the mission. Very intriguing. This is why they could not involve almost anybody in this raid. This is why so many things, this is why nothing was signed off on. This is why so many people weren't aware that this was happening, because if you're going to try to get an Enigma machine, that needs to be done with the utmost secrecy. So conducting a good raid with the intents and purposes outlined wasn't actually the objective. So if it fell off the rails, well, too bad. But if they can get their Enigma machine, that was the ultimate goal, the underlying goal, and the thing that they needed to accomplish. Forget capturing the port and not destroying it in the process. That's the cover. That's not the reality of the raid. Throughout the battle, the focus of the raid remained resolutely to reach the trawlers in the naval headquarters, even when more attractive opportunities for advancing presented themselves. And it's clear that the Germans frantically attempted to drop overboard 7 bags of top-secret signals. The last bag failed to sink, and attempts to make it do so with grenades led to the material being showered over the dock. So there's mounting evidence that the point of this raid was to gain intelligence information, secret information, and an Enigma machine, not the original objectives that they outlined for the raid, not to make it seem like an invasion, not even to work with the Russians, which was the initial reason given for the raid. But it was to gain this material because you can see that the advances that they made were always in the direction of getting to the secret documents and the secret information. If the raid was all about securing this port, making it look like an invasion, helping the Russians, all of these very attractive opportunities that would have projected them forward towards that goal were ignored. So you can see in the route that they took during that raid where their intentions lay. Now, the minutes of one chief of staff meeting read, concerning the withholding of information that the Dieppe raid was to take place, Lord Louis Mountbatten explained that the necessary people had always been informed of previous operations, and that there was no intention of withholding information in future from those whose duty necessitated their being so informed. On the particular occasion of Dieppe, however, he had received special instructions from the chiefs of staff that only certain individuals were to be informed of the intention to remount the operation. He had been compelled, in fact, even to mislead his own staff on this occasion. So he did actively work to lie to the people in his staff who he didn't want to know about this, but perhaps there was a good reason for it. It would appear the evidence shows that there was a real reason for this raid. It's just that not many people knew about it at the time. Mountbatten knows, though, that he can't tell people why he did that raid, so the spin must begin. They must be left believing that the raid was intended to secure a port and not destroy it, and to work with the Russians, and to make it look like an invasion. So that's the public knowledge of it, and he's going to have to spin it in his favor. Mountbatten had always been a master of public relations, skillfully using publicity for an event or organization to forward his own career, and the disaster was given a positive spin. At Combined Operations Headquarters, he had set up a news briefing system, which he would refine in all his subsequent appointments, and on his publicity staff were the former head of 20th Century Fox, Darrell F. Zanuck, who had been active in the Royal Navy Film Corporation, Jock Lawrence, Sam Goldwyn's publicist, and David Astor, already planning his relaunch of The Observer. This high-level galaxy of spin doctors ensured that from the beginning the Dieppe disaster was carefully controlled and presented as a success, a strategy that backfired when German news agencies began to present a very different picture. The thing is, it was too much of a wreck for him to completely cover up. Even him and all his spin doctors could not make people ignore the fact that thousands of lives had been churned up in this meat grinding operation of his. As the size of the losses sunk in, questions began to be asked in Whitehall about Mountbatten's future as combined operations. The head of the political warfare executive, Robert Bruce Lockhart, after lunching with General Dallas Brooks on June 15th, had already noted in his diary, "There is considerable feeling against Dickie Mountbatten, both in the Royal Navy proper and in the Marines. The charge is that he is setting up a rival navy for a series of stunts, which are useless unless linked with the general strategy." All right, well, Dickie is not going to sit around and let people try to tell him how it was. He's here to tell you he did just fine. So 10 days later after the raid, Sir Ellen Brooke, dining at Chequers, raised his concern about the raid with Mountbatten, occasioning the head of Combined Operations to respond, "I was absolutely dumbfounded when you made your very outspoken criticism of the manner in which the Dieppe raid was planned." Somebody like Mountbatten, of course, would say, "What are you even talking about? I can't even believe you would think that that was a failure. I followed procedure. What are you talking about? Really? You think that was a failure? You think there was something I didn't do right? I don't know what you're talking about." That's pretty bold of him to say I followed proper procedures. He didn't. Over and over and over he didn't, and anybody could have pointed out 1,000 ways in which he had failed. Brooke remained unsatisfied, and he began to encourage Churchill to press Mountbatten on why Dieppe had failed so spectacularly. Dickie, skilled in the ways of Whitehall, deflected the blame onto Roberts, insisting that the planning, if followed properly, would have been successful, and that in any case the lessons learned had justified the cost. So Dieppe had, however, dented his reputation. "I had a very heated discussion in the Chiefs of Staff lasting about an hour concerning the role and charter of Mountbatten as Chief of Combined Operations," wrote Brooke in his diary on December 22nd. "The suggestion being that he should command the naval forces for an invasion of France Portal and Pug Ismay were supporting him, and Dudley Pound and I were dead against it, on the basis that his job is one of an advisory and not of a commander. We finally shook the other two, and we went a long way towards making the point. It's truly shocking how so many failures, and not just as the Dieppe raid, but just him when he was commanding a ship, how many failures he has managed to dodge and re-narrate and recast in some positive light. It's truly shocking at what he was able to get away with. So how did he move forward? How could he? How could this person who just, his name is attached to so many disgraceful and catastrophic events, somehow continues to fail up? How did he do it? The book says that for all his problems at combined operations, Mountbatten had many successes with small landing operations. At the end of the year, Operation Frankton, which involved 6 canoes fixing limpet mines to cargo boats at the docks of Bordeaux, took place. The operation, immortalized in the film The Cockshell Heroes, damaged 4 ships, but at a high human cost. Only 2 of the 12 canoeists returned, having crossed the Pyrenees in Spain to Gibraltar. That's a success. Okay. Well, but there were others. The main priority were the Anglo-American landings in North Africa, Operation Torch in November 1942, designed to open up a new front and use American forces that combined operations supported. And this was followed by Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, planned for the summer of 1943. With the creation of the new role of Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, the role of Combined Operations Headquarter had begun to shrink, but it continued to focus on planning for what would eventually become Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings. Its priority was to have ready 4,500 fully crewed assault ships and landing craft by 1944. One of Combined Operation Headquarters' greatest achievements was developing important innovations in modern warfare. This included artificial harbors that could be towed across the channel. Pluto, which is a pipeline under the ocean, which at its peak was allowing 1 million gallons of petrol to be sent to France each day, equipment to demolish underwater obstacles, waterproof engines so vehicles could be driven ashore, and even a spring-loaded walking stick to test the hardness of a beach. So his ability to continue chugging along is based solely on the fact that there were a couple of victories. And if he could spin the negatives into positives, imagine what he did with the decent things he was able to accomplish. Mountbatten's experience at headquarters also worked to mature him as a leader. And it made him, if not always popular, a very astute political operator. He could still be impetuous, but he had learned to be more calculating in his pursuit of power and manipulative in exercising it. The head of his secretariat, Captain N.T.P. Cooper, remembered. A useful little device, which I installed under his desk, was an electric bell, which, when he was tired of his current visitor, he would press with his knees, which was a signal for me to go into his room to remind him of a very frightfully important appointment, which was, of course, imaginary. Ultimately, though, Mountbatten's greatest weapons in his arsenal were his charm, strong work ethic, and his ability to get along with everybody. The broadcaster Arthur Marshall, attached to Combined's operations, remembered how all offices in the headquarters were invited, usually in pairs, to have lunch with the Mountbattens in their house in Chester Street. They could not have been easier or more welcoming, and they made one feel that this had, for them, been the treat of the week. That's very clever. He was much influenced by Morris Maeterlinck's theory of the spirit of the hive in his book, The Life of the Bee, which argued the benefits of teamwork. A particular skill was man management. His deputy, Charles Hayden, upset about not being told about the dismounting of the Dieppe raid, proffered his resignation. But Mountbatten saw him immediately, and the next day, Hayden was writing, "You are, a very difficult person to deal with. Yesterday I felt angry, sore, and hardly done by. Today I feel a worm for even having harbored any of those feelings. I really do." Great powers of manipulation this Mountbatten had. To not let a person sit there and marinate in their own bitterness, but to rush in and explain the fact that, how can you think that I would have hurt you on purpose? You know I would never do that. And yet you are so willing to run away the minute something happens. You're so willing to run away just because you didn't know about the Dieppe raid. You have to understand, I had to keep that secret. I was told by the chiefs of staff. I couldn't tell you. I always thought we were better friends than this. And now you want to just leave. I mean, you have to do what you need to do, but I'm just surprised our friendship couldn't withstand this. And then we've got poor Hayden over there wringing his hands, being like, I'm a worm. How could I have thought this? There's countless examples of his interpersonal skills winning around his opponents. In April 1943, his punishing workload, often he worked 16 to 18-hour days with weekly tours of the units of his command, caught up with him and he came down with pneumonia. It was the sickest he'd been since being a kid. And so he decided to take off a month. In fact, his doctor told him that if he had neglected his condition for even 24 hours more, he would have been dead. So it was incumbent upon him and his survival to take some time off. For a month, he recuperated at Broadlands, where he saw much of Edwina. Her war work was also taking its toll on her. "I felt terrible all day," she wrote in her diary at the end of May. "I worked hard all the same." It was hard to believe that before the war, she was reckoned to be one of the most beautiful women in England, recalled a member of her staff. She was gray and haggard and lined. Even her beautiful eyes looked tired behind her thick spectacles. In July 1942, she'd been appointed superintendent-in-chief of the nursing division, the highest post a woman could hold. She was now responsible for 60,000 adult volunteers and 10,000 cadets. She continued to travel widely throughout the country, visiting convalescent homes, blood transfusion centers, hospitals, and ARP posts, opening bazaars, presiding at auctions, and inspecting guards of honor. Recognition of her work came with the reward of CBE in the New Year's honors list. She discovered that, like her husband, she had leadership qualities. She, too, could use her high-level connections to ensure things happened, and was always well prepared. She had, at last, been given something useful to do, and she had risen to the challenge, much to the pride of Dickie. Is that it? No. You hang on for just a minute. Now we're going to come to the part of the story that really had popped my eyes. At the beginning of August 1943, Mountbatten, as a member of the Chiefs of Staff, sailed on the Queen Mary for Quebec, one of 150 officers going to the Quebec Conference. The meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt was to shape future grand strategy and especially discuss the invasion of Europe. It also gave Mountbatten an opportunity to demonstrate to the Chiefs of Staff a new invention for combined operations. Okay, just hold your horses, y'all. This invention is seemingly so dumb. I can't even imagine that this passed any kind of test or anything like that. Maybe this shows my yawning ignorance as much does, but I can't even believe he would come and try to sell this to anybody. An aircraft carrier, 2,000 feet in length, made of frozen seawater and wood pulp, which could be positioned as a refueling stop for aircraft in the Atlantic. What? Ice and wood chips? And we're going to land something on that? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's like an iceberg or something. Maybe that was like the concept here. He chose to demonstrate the worth of this potential idea after a particularly acrimonious meeting in which the American Admiral Ernest King had punched a British officer, and the room had to be cleared of most of the officials. Mountbatten proceeded to produce 2 bits of ice, one purely consisting of water, and the other of wood chips. He then drew his revolver. Firing at the first, it shattered into a series of ice splinters. He now took aim at the second. Ricocheting off the block, the bullet buzzed around the room, grazing the leg of Admiral King before burying itself into a wall. There was a stunned silence, and then from outside the room a voice piped up, "Oh God, they've started shooting each other now!" I mean, this is like, can we make a comedy about this? Dickie knew this time at Combined Operations was probably coming to an end soon. Yeah, you don't think? And he took every opportunity on board ship to press Dudley Pound for a date when he might return to sea. What he had not realized was that Churchill had other plans for him. And that is the end. So, oh man, what a journey. This Dickie Mountbatten, I don't know what to make of him. I don't know what to make of him at all. I think that he is profoundly adept at manipulating others and manipulating the facts to serve his own narrative. But I do think that there is a possibility that in this one instance, he might actually have had a legitimate reason for the Dieppe raid. What we didn't actually find out, though, was, did they secure an Enigma machine? I know that was the proposed objective, but did that actually happen? The book didn't actually tell us that, and I forgot to look it up. All right, well, I'll let you guys know in the next video. I'll give us a little update if they actually managed to do it. I'm thinking they didn't, or else it seems like the book would have said so. Who knows? But then again, they were then later able to decode some of the messages, some of the German messages. So maybe, I don't know. All right, well, I will find out a little bit more about that because now I have questions. But I will see you guys later this week, probably this weekend, with another edition of the Harry and Meghan documentary series This next episode, as much as I hated watching it, was also a little bit more entertaining to me. I mean, when we weren't talking about how Western civilization is the cause of every evil that ever resulted in the world, they really wanted to push that narrative. All right, but we'll talk later about that. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll try to get some more episodes of this out next week, as well as continue with the Harry and Meghan documentary. So thank you guys for always coming to the channel and supporting the different series on the channel, and thank you for always commenting and liking and all that sort of thing. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye.